I've been attending Halloween Horror Nights Orlando since 2010, and in that time, I've managed to experience a staggering 105 haunts. That's higher than I can count, I think. I've seen the event grow from being defined by its groundbreaking original concepts through the dark ages of the Walking Dead takeover to struggling with its identity as horror IPs began to dominate the mainstream. Now, since 2023 is going to be the 13th year that I've attended, I wanted to rank up all those haunts I've been through and keep their memory alive. And, of course, our favorite scaredy cats will be along for the ride. A lot of you are probably going to want to burn me at the stake for these rankings, so on your way down to the comments to tell me off, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. I'm 6 Billiam, and I can already feel the repressed childhood trauma and teenage angst boiling up, so let's get to it. Now just remember, my opinion shouldn't detract from the tireless work and the passion that gets poured into this event. Success doesn't exist without failure, and sometimes even the pros get it wrong. So if you're watching this, keep pushing, don't give up, because you'll get there. Now let's get to these rankings, and it's up to Cohen, the king of the stink, to start us off on the right paw, or foot. Lunatic's Playground, You Won't Stand a Chance, isn't a haunt that I'm going to talk about much. Take a look at this tagline and tell me if you expected the icon of the event to receive a terribly cheap 3D haunt. Perhaps my expectations were just a little too high, but Chance deserved so much better, and there was unlimited potential to explore the theater of the mind concept, especially after experiencing her scare zone. On top of being generally poor in execution, there were negative depictions of self-harm and mental illness in this haunt, and that's just not cool. I'm all for pushing boundaries to their extremes, but not when it comes at the expense of others. I've talked about 2022's Halloween way too much recently, so I'm just gonna leave it at this. It fails to innovate in the way that any of its predecessors did, and plays more like one of the many cheap imitations they inspired, with cookie-cutter scenes and scares. John Carpenter's musical cues remain a constant strength, and I'm not judging you if you do like this haunt, but if all traces of Michael Myers were removed and this was an original haunt, would you still rank this as one of the best of all time? Afterlife Death's Vengeance is one of those haunts that I was actually pretty stoked for. A 3D haunt that travels through the mind of serial killer Bobby the Blade as he passes over into the afterlife. Many sets, costumes, and effects were reused from far more successful 3D haunts that weren't even a couple years old, and ending the haunt with the anticlimactic spinning tunnel was a very odd choice. The initial execution scene of Bobby was pretty cool before entering an inverted and 3D version. The mirror room with body bags full of the Blade's victims and stabbing sounds was tons of fun too, but two inventive scenes couldn't save this haunt from familiarity and filler scenes with some weak 3D effects. Havoc Derailed is almost like two different haunts, but neither of them worked for me. The premise is that super soldiers are being transported on a high-speed train that later crashes, giving this haunt those distinct sections. While the lights in the train cars did simulate movement, these scenes were long, narrow, and boring, with nothing for the soldiers to do except wander around, or just act like manifestations of the voices in my head. The crash was cool in concept, simulated by an inflatable tunnel and a loud mirror room, but it was atrocious for the pacing. The first half dragged like you wouldn't believe, and the second half was a sprint to the finish through some sets that had no rhyme or reason, just junk everywhere. It's upsetting that a lot of creative and effective scare tactics were used in the back half. Despite being really cool, they've been mostly lost to time due to this haunt's failure. I don't think anyone should be surprised to see The Purge all the way down here. Fun fact, this haunt was originally themed to Scream, and you can see notable references including Casey Becker herself, the Woodsboro High bathroom, and even Olivia's room from Scream 4. Those sets were simply covered with graffiti and strobe lights, and the haunt was just sensory overload in the worst way. 4 minutes of nonsensical screaming, poorly aged gun violence, and metal banging sounds literally everywhere just weren't scary. While there were some actors that were planted in the conga line that would then be murdered by the Purge characters, and an announcer out front that called out guests for being douchebags, legendary, the Purge hasn't been remembered fondly by, frankly, anyone. Saw, the games of Jigsaw, commits the cardinal sin of being boring. One of my top horror franchises of all time, I was really hoping for an interesting twist on the formula, but the entire thing seemed like a cheesy, fan-made Jigsaw museum. It was a smart design to create a gauntlet-type hallway that showcased a lot of the cooler traps that weren't substantive enough for a whole scene, and there were some effective scares from pig-masked assailants and a visit through the classic bathroom. However, this haunt never created a sense of danger for the guests nor the victims, and not even a few guest-activated triggers could prevent this haunt from becoming a snooze fest. It's time to talk about one of the most spectacular failures in HHN Orlando's history, Dracula Untold: Reign of Blood. It's It's the last time that Universal translated an IP that wouldn't have been released until after the event started. Well, at least officially. The filming process proved turbulent and caused the haunt to be almost unrecognizable from the film, except for also being lifeless and generic. The sets were cookie cutter, the scares were pointless, and the transitions were non-existent. What do moving statues have to do with Dracula again? Anyways, Baba Yaga's hut was the saving grace as a detailed fairy tale set with a delicious cookie scent, and Dracula's arrival from Legends Collide got its start here, but Dracula Untold was just doomed from the start. Now, if the OGs haven't crucified me yet, this is gonna be the haunt to do it. 2010 was my first year, and I just didn't get Zombiegeddon. 13 years later, and it's even harder to find any media on the zombie awareness program, so I can't even hope that my opinion changes. Tamed zombies were being pushed around and used as target practice around the ZAP headquarters before a parade float from the adjoining Zombie Gras scare zone crashed into the facility, releasing those zombies and changing the tone to visceral terror. But from what I remember, the funny parts just weren't funny, and the scary parts just weren't scary. By year 4, The Walking Dead had reached the end of its lifespan. Coming off of the biggest ever haunt at HHN Orlando, The Living and the Dead was such a huge step backwards. The big risk that this haunt took was featuring characters in water environments, which ended up being just characters in glorified kiddie pools. The fact that many of the environments have been seen in the franchise before, or had been seen in a similar haunt recently at HHN Orlando, didn't help the fatigue for the property, so even some of the more interesting scenes felt like a repeat of the past. However, I am a sucker for outdoor scenes, and The Walking Dead haunts always delivered in that aspect. The Living and the Dead just wasn't as ballsy as its predecessors, and the walkers were treated more like set dressing than set pieces to actually be afraid of. I hate putting Ash vs. Evil Dead this low, so let's just get to it. It checked all the right boxes for plot points and set pieces, but it was designed in such an awkwardly askew way that if you weren't a Deadite contorting your body, you wouldn't see these scenes properly. Seeing Ash pop out of an empty cabin facade and interacting with nothing, only to arrive in the living room of the cabin in the very next scene, was such an odd design choice. However, everything about Ash Williams was perfection. Ashy Slashy was even invited to the party, and there's a post-credit scene where Ash opens a keg with his chainsaw. This should have been goated, but Ash was treated like supporting comic relief instead of the hero that he was. Evil Dead has always been about that dichotomy, but the focus on goofiness resulted in a disjointed haunt. The Shining was a terrific adaptation by HHN Orlando standards, but I'd argue that this would have been torn to shreds if this exact version popped up anywhere else besides Universal. Where's the Overlook Hotel facade? Why is the hedge maze not even really a maze? Why does there need to be filler scenes like an endless hallway of "Here's Johnny" and a mirror maze of all things? The empty and sanitized sets were translated pretty well from the film, but it's so boring to walk through a haunted house when there's no scenery and the lighting is flat. The elevator scene proves that Universal can deliver on the wild practical effects, but The Shining needed to feel different from anything that had been done before, and it just felt like more of the same. Those sentiments also ring true for The Exorcist. While I didn't really enjoy this haunt, there are a number of things to be applauded. Everything about this facade screams best of all time, and I'm not joking. That score is even more iconic than Halloween's, and the first quarter of this haunt is outstanding. Things only go downhill once the sensory rooms are introduced. They were captivating ideas that overstayed their welcome. It's also worth noting that the different bedroom setups for Regan were all unique with enough twists to keep them feeling fresh, and the animatronic work really wasn't too shabby either. Demon faces would also occasionally shine on the walls for a nice scare, but overall, the haunt was overlong and dragged out its fresh ideas to death. And no Spider Reagan for HHN Orlando. Bye. Hellblock Horror was just okay. It was just boo box after boo box and jump scare after jump scare with absolutely nothing to write home about. The Easter eggs and the lore were pretty cool, and the facade was surprisingly one of the best of the year, but it was the HHN Orlando formula to a T. Roanoke Cannibal Colony was a fun twist on the zombie subgenre, but it got memed to death for being just a bit too campy. Overall, the haunt was just fine, but a lot of the victim gimmicks were way too low quality for the serious tone. This haunt did make me hungry for though. I did thoroughly enjoy the historical setting, but that also meant a lot of the scenic design felt the same. flat facades, limited interiors, and a lot of barn-type environments with the exact same blocking and flow. At least that tobacco smell was 10 out of 10, and those stilt-walking Wendigos ended the haunt with ferocity. Freddy vs. Jason was less interesting than watching my cats fight. Individually, their sections were fine. Jason had what was 100% a BioShock reference, and you can't convince me otherwise, and also a pretty cool underwater scene. Freddy had that massive mid-haunt facade and well-constructed vignettes of his greatest kills from the franchise. However, the big battle occurred through poorly conceived fight scenes playing on screens and static dummies being attacked. I really did like this idea. I just wish they could have hung from a track or had some kind of movement to feel more natural. Both of these icons had innovative haunts in 2007 that expanded on their characters, but this mashup wanted us to cheer for the same old battles that we'd seen time and time again. Run! Blood, Sweat, and Fears was my first run haunt, and Eddie was an icon I was completely obsessed with. I even have some rare memorabilia from the first run haunt somewhere. So to see how his child had been massacred was an incredibly tough blow. I didn't mind the campiness. In fact, I actually thought it was a clever subversion, but it didn't come hand in hand with the intense scares that were expected. The bathroom was a short little scare fest with the mummies darting in and out, and the Canada room was a nice novelty with the lumberjacks wielding chainsaws. However, most of the nations were surface level caricatures with surface level sets, and the forced fan service drugged down what could have been a pretty fun haunt. Now this is the point where the haunts start getting consistently good. So sadly, it's time to bid Cohen a farewell. We'll be checking in with Angle for those haunts that were good, but not spectacular, just like how she felt about my skills as her cat dad. The Horrors of Blumhouse Volume 2 places slightly lower than its predecessor because it's the most basic, but it really wasn't that bad. These haunts get kind of a bad rep, but they do exactly what their films do: provide cheap jump scares and easy digestible content. Happy Death Day was a really fun section with surprisingly suspenseful scare setups, try saying that 5 times fast, and some convincingly detailed sets. The scares are intense while still remaining playful, and the parking garage scene had some great blocking. The first Purge section, however, was pretty standard, and despite the fun mannequin room, it had a pretty clunky finale. I was also surprised at the height of those sets, and it's too bad they didn't do anything cool with them. The Horrors of Blumhouse Volume 1 had better scare setups despite its awkward pacing. The Purge section was better than its standalone haunt, but the bar was also abysmally low. Sinister, however, is a frighteningly effective first section, with that film camera scare being one of my favorite scare interactions ever. And the church going pitch black before Bagul pops out from everywhere, bro, that was terrifying. Insidious was the largest section, and there were a lot of very small but effective scenes and scares. And while 6 years later I'm still not caught up on the Insidious franchise, this scene was pretty freaking cool. The finale was also surprisingly well done, and the cramped nature meant that those scares were right in your face. Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers, is a decent haunt for Mikey, but it's a terrible representation of the film. Seeing Mikey all bandaged up before donning his mask provides needed variety in the scares, and some of the kills from the film seem to be expanded upon. Iconic scenes that play with depth are shrunk down to quick hallways or completely omitted, hindering what could have been standout set pieces. But the Transformer scene was still pretty cool with the animatronic and the burning smell, and the latter half of the haunt hits all the right beats without doing anything spectacular. But man, that finale, it's so astonishingly simple, but that lighting package elevates this simple setup to one of my favorite vistas in HHN Orlando's history. Killer Clowns from Outer Space is a little bit hard for me to rank because so much of this haunt's success depended on those characters. And for what it's worth, those costumes are phenomenal and the cast slaughtered it every single night. Still, it seemed there was a lot of cool stuff that was shrunk down, and I really wanted to explore Crescent Cove with more detailed sets because that shadow puppet scene set the bar so high. Inside the spaceship, everything seemed to lose focus. The characters were there, but not many of them were given much to do. I gotta shout out that cotton candy room finale for making my skin crawl every single time, even with those black walls everywhere. And I just think Killer Clowns needed to be a little bit longer, a little zanier, and a little more interactive to reach its full potential. Asylum in Wonderland fell short because it used a lot of those cheap 3D tricks as a crutch, but this haunt did achieve success with innovative scare designs. I know it's gotta be so physically taxing, but I'm all for these gymnastics characters every single year. Some scenes integrated those 3D effects into detailed physical environments, which is how I believe all of these haunts in the genre should operate, and I would have loved to have seen that concept applied to each scene. It's about a 50-50 split between the wondrous and the familiar, and the whimsical costuming does help help this haunt rise above its peers. However, just like that downer ending, a perfect Wonderland was just out of reach. The Fallen had incredible potential to be one of those all-time period haunts, but instead it was cleansed of its angel vs. demons theme before the event started, leaving only the demons. This facade was fittingly demonic, with this demon's growl shaking the entire haunt, and it's disappointing that the bark was worse than the bite. While there's some spectacular design work and a lot of noteworthy props and accents, it was still just your pretty standard vision of hell, with a layout that's a mashup of popular room designs from many HHN haunts. There were a staggering amount of bungee scares, but they just weren't that innovative or exciting, and they failed to land. I guess it's a good thing they didn't though, because then they really would have been the Fallen. But on a side note, I did do Q build for this haunt and Dead Waters, so it does hold a pretty special place in my heart. Still got it. Revenge of the Tooth Fairy is another one that pains me to put so low on this list, but it was just an okay haunt. The themed narration throughout was inspired and flawlessly executed, and the storybook facade may be one of the most eye-popping in history, and I can't wait to see that idea evolve. The rest of the sets were also beautiful, but still cramped and familiar, and lacking any exciting set pieces or effects. Misdirection was common and very effective in this haunt, from the maid's quarters to the laundry room, and I had a lot of fun in each and every scene. But even after multiple seasons, Revenge of the Tooth Fairy couldn't quite crack the code to translate the S-tier concept into something completely unforgettable. The final iteration of The Walking Dead was basically like Platinum Dunes remaking the 2012 original. The foundation was the same, but the additions felt like a soulless way to drag out the property for one final cash grab. I did like the integration of scenery from when The Walking Dead took over the streets in 2013, but it wasn't a memorable way to close out the long-running series. I really wish we had more rock and roll haunts throughout the years, because Alice Cooper, Welcome to My Nightmare wasn't too shabby. I wish I remembered more of it, but in my notes from over a decade ago I said this haunt was pretty legit, so I guess we're gonna run with that. I certainly can't complain about the inventive costuming and the unexpected environments, including that disorientingly sick Black Widow's lair. Even if this haunt really wasn't a home run, it was one of a kind at HHN Orlando, and the killer soundtrack didn't hurt either. Stranger Things gets unfairly maligned as the harbinger of family-friendly IPs at HHN, but honestly, this is exactly what the event needed. Big budget spectacles that can bring larger-than-life set pieces, and technical wizardry that isn't seen almost anywhere else. The problem with number 2, like with many translations, was the focus on plot over the experience. Hopper's Cabin and Starcourt Mall will go down for many as the most memorable creations of the event, and the smaller scenes that litter the first half are effects-laden character moments that bring a personal connection to the haunt. But this is a haunted house after all, and Stranger Things forgot that sometimes. Yes, the closing of the gate was as jaw-dropping as it could get, but what part of that scene benefited the overall haunt? Those dummies were bad, the room was empty, and it killed the momentum. It's like watching a bunch of still images in a YouTube video, and who wants to suffer through that? Well, there you have it, my friends. Those are the 25 worst haunts that I've experienced at HHN Orlando. And since my socks haven't quite been knocked off yet, we'll be continuing the next part with the end of Angel's collection. Let me know your least favorite haunt down in the comments, and if you have any guesses for what you think my number 1's gonna be, let me know that as well. Stay tuned next week for numbers 79 through 55, and until we meet again, go out there and make that world a better place. Take care, everyone. Thank you for your support.